was larger than life. And he was able to project all his kind of wittiness, his excitement, his verve, all of that through his trumpet just by blowing a note.
Dizzy had that impish.
I walked into the bathroom, and Dizzy was there looking in the mirror going, he turned around to me, he said, "I look like a f***ing frog." And I asked him, "Why do you play that way?" He said, "I can't help it." He said, the muscles got so loose, they just got bigger and bigger and bigger. Now I can't control it at all.
That's one of the ways that Dizzy got that sound that he got, was his cheeks would puff.
By the 60s, Dizzy Gillespie had become a grandee of jazz, a teacher, and a valiant ambassador for the black cause.
Oh, wait.
But 20 years earlier, John Burks Gillespie got his nickname Dizzy as a young rebel who burst onto the jazz world with an explosive new sound. A sound so strange that at first nobody knew what to call it.
Someone asked Dizzy, after he played his composition Bebop, what is this music called? And Dizzy thought that they were referring to the tune that he just played, Bebop. And he said, "That's Bebop." So then they started calling the total music Bebop.
Bebop was seen like as a sort of the punk music of its era. Something which was sort of quite radical, quite different, had people completely split into two different camps about whether it was any good or not.
It was fast and exciting. In fact, a lot of the older musicians didn't like it. They called it Chinese music. You know, they said, "Oh, you're playing crazy music. You know, that's weird. You're playing wrong notes. You know."
People didn't understand it. People couldn't dance to it. And also it could probably be said that it was the first time that black jazz musicians really stood up and were very strong, even though there was the discrimination at that time. They really stood up for themselves and said, well, this is what the music is, and if you can't get it, it's okay.
Jazz music in the 1930s was very dance-based, and it had to be at a tempo and a feel and a sort of a form that people could dance to. Jazz musicians were mostly at that time constrained to playing short solos in the middle of big band sets. So a big band would play a tune, there'd be a little break, 8 bars, somebody would have a little solo, and that'd be the end of it. But of course the musicians like Dizzy, being really interesting musicians, wanted to extend their creative powers, if you like. They wanted to improvise more.
It was in the clubs and bars of New York that Dizzy and his band of like-minded rebels laid down the blueprint for the new music. They were bored with their roles in the big swing bands and wanted to play something new. A favorite hangout was Minton's Playhouse in Harlem, where they used to jam together after hours. The sessions were organized by the drummer Kenny Clark, whose different beat laid the foundation of the new music.
Swing drummers had a job, which was to support the rest of the band. So basically, they did something very, very simple, which was just to keep the time. Now, when it came to playing bebop, people like Kenny Clark had a tendency to play in and around the time, but yet it was very, very solid. Between the bass drum and snare drum, there were bombs dropped, as we call them, which were primarily patterns that were not predictable patterns, sounding somewhat like this.
Dizzy had a very, very strong concept of rhythm, and he would think up rhythms first, and then he would put notes. He was so harmonically adept that he could pick notes to fit those rhythms. So if you picked a rhythm, that let up, bad let up, Dizzy might say, and Dizzy a lot of times thought like a drummer. That's a drum lick. Salt peanuts, salt peanuts.
Salt peanuts, salt peanuts. Salt peanuts, salt peanuts. Salt peanuts, salt peanuts.
Jazz musicians took tunes which they played night after night after night, and everybody knew very well. And then they wrote their own melodies to them. For instance, Dizzy did Salt Peanuts based on George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm, which everybody knew. And after hours, they get together to do jam sessions on these standard tunes. But rather than playing them in the way they did in the big band, which was for dancing, they created vehicles for improvisation. And that changed the whole concept of the way they performed them. The bass player, for instance, in the big band would play a kind of a dancing two-feel, a boom, boom, a boom, boom. But when the music sped up and became more directional, then they'd play walking bass, ga-doom, ba-doom, doom, 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 doom. The drummer, instead of playing ka-doom, 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 would start to syncopate and work around it. Boom, boom, boom. Piano players, boom, dum, 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 change it, dum, ding, dum, dum. And in front of all this, you'd have a soloist like Dizzy who'd create their own improvisations with much more melodic content than they ever got to play in the big band, and a lot longer. Of this music together in this new rhythmic context, and much faster than they ever played before, spawned bebop.
You're watching Dizzy Gillespie, part of American Revolutionaries Rock and Soul.
Dizzy's idol was the swing trumpeter Roy Eldridge.
At the time Dizzy was growing up, Roy Eldridge was, quote, unquote, the cat.
Eldridge played high and fast, but kept to the regular swing rhythm and harmonies.
So Dizzy, to extend Roy Eldridge's style, one of the things that he did was change the harmony.
Using notes that other people hadn't used before. He managed to pick the new notes, the ones around the melody, the ones up in the high parts of the chords, and develop improvisations around them. And he did it at a breakneck speed that was almost impossible to comprehend the first time through. But Dizzy knew exactly what he was playing.
Dizzy's style of playing often got him into trouble with his employers, most famously with the band leader Cab Calloway. Calloway fired him after Dizzy stabbed him with a knife. The experience made Dizzy determined to break away from the old school of black entertainment.
Cab Calloway would come out in a bright white suit with the mugging and grinning. He was part of the old vaudeville minstrel entertainment tradition. But the boppers were going to get away from that. They wanted to get away from the minstrel tradition altogether. And so they presented themselves in this rather formal manner.
One of the things that Dizzy Gillespie introduced is the wearing of horn-rimmed glasses, and many of them wore beards or goatees, which were the mark of basically very fruity guys. You know, guys that you wouldn't pay any attention to because they were nerdy. They were the sort of people you had nothing to do with. We were like tough guys, right? But here were musicians who lived a really ragged sort of life, a nightlife, a life that had very little to do with, like, the norms, and yet they also presented themselves as intellectuals. We sort of like cottoned to that, if you will.
It was the mid-1940s. The war was over, and a new phenomenon grabbed the headlines. Rebellious teenagers, and their heroes were the kings of bop.
The idea of bebop being exclusive was exactly what we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be this little club. We wanted it to be like, you know, a kind of ideal, hip world in which we lived.
Dizzy's music and hip look became the sound and style of post-war New York, a legacy which can still be seen on the streets today. But Dizzy wasn't satisfied. He wanted his music to be big.
Charlie Parker and the famous Dizzy Gillespie. Now, fellas, Leonard says I'm supposed to be the Toastmaster, the sort of Georgie Jessel of jazz. So, Charlie, I want to award you now the Downbeat Award for the best alto.
Of all the talented musicians involved in the bebop movement, it was Dizzy's partnership with Charlie Yardbird Parker that defined the bebop sound. Bird and Diz, as they were known, became one of the great musical collaborations of the 20th century.
Got anything more to say?
Well, Earl, they say music speaks louder than words, so we'd rather voice our opinion that way, if you don't.
Dizzy said that Charlie Parker told him that Dizzy's heart beat on one beat and Charlie Parker's heart beat on the next beat. That's how close they were. And I don't think there has ever been a partnership before or since that phrased music together, two people as one, as these two did.
Their partnership was brief and intense, but the recordings they made are some of the clap bop, such as Hot House.
It was an original melody written over a pop song written by Cole Porter, which was entitled What Is This Thing Called Love? And it sounds like this. And then what they did with it was, you know, bebopize it, I guess, you know.
That's kind of illustrates really what bebop is about. I mean, the start of the tune, there's this sort of dialogue between Bird and Dizzy. And then when Bird takes the solo, the start, he's playing double time, something like really quickly over already a very fast tempo.
Fast, furious, angry sounding phrase with a lot of tension in it, and then release that with a phrase that sounded like this. So the real swing feel, which is like this, you know, you could actually hear that in that phrase, you know. It's like,
at the end of Bird's solo, you see Dizzy Gillespie immediately take up a phrase that Bird has played, and then he's taking it onto another level.
At that time, he started to play this idea from Carmen. Ba, 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 da, 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 da. And he was really starting to solidify the ideas that Charlie Parker and he shared. And it was coming together to start to bring his style to a complete style.
There's a constant dialogue between the rhythm section and the horns, which is very much the new element of the music. The drummer will play a rhythmic figure and Bird will latch onto that immediately, and then he's off. He's heard what someone else has played, incorporated that into his own playing, then taken it on to another place. There's this dialogue, this constant flux of change in the music, but at the same time, people feeding off each other.
Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker were two entirely different kinds of people. Charlie Parker was a guy who obviously had emotional problems of one kind or another. He was ruthless with his friends. He was always borrowing people's horns and then hawking them, going off with their suits. Whatever he needed, he took. He was a terrible drug user. He drank a great deal. Gillespie was, despite the impishness, despite the fun he liked to have on the stand, was all business. He was intelligent, mature guy who knew how to handle his career. He knew how to manipulate the show business people around him.
Dizzy was dedicated to his music. He couldn't stand to see Parker waste himself on drugs, so they parted company. Parker's addictions finally killed him in 1955. He was only 34, but he had the body of a 65-year-old. Dizzy earned his nickname because of his goofball humor, and he used it to win over audiences to his music. In 1945, he had formed the first of his big bands. His aim was to make his music popular.
He would do some showmanship. He'd go out very frequently for the first number and play something very simple that audiences wouldn't have any trouble with. And he said, now I'll get them on my side. I'll get them on my side, and then we're going to go and play some of this more difficult music that we really like. He had a sense that he was dealing with real people, that you can't just dictate to the audience what they're going to like. And certainly, by what he was doing, helped to make bebop much more popular than it might have been otherwise.
But Dizzy was always looking for something new. His passion for rhythm brought him together with Cuban conga drummer Chano Pazzo in 1947. The result was a mixture of Cuban rhythms and bebop, which became known as Cubop.
The Latin American beat is basically this. Now I'll count. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, that's superimposed against the bebop.
Although Dizzy and Chano's partnership was short-lived, Dizzy had found a lifelong passion in Latin American music and a novel way to play it.
The embouchure, that is the way your lips work, you know, that's the sort of, that's the center part of any brass player's arsenal. Dizzy had a fantastic embouchure. If you look at him playing in the early footage, his embouchure is perfect. All of this is nice and tight. He's got great control. But as he got older and older, these muscles seem to have gotten weakened, and he sort of spread out, spread out, and spread out until later in life he had huge pouches out here and down here. But it never really, it didn't affect the way he played the trumpet, except maybe it influenced the sound a little bit, but he never chose to do that.
Dizzy's trumpet style, with cheeks bloated and bent horn, became his signature. He started playing the bent trumpet after someone fell on it by accident and bent it in half.
Dizzy thought that there was a better way to hear what he was doing, that the sound was closer to the ear, and that he could hear himself better. So he asked his instrument company at that time, the Martin Company, if they could make him one. They made him one, and history was made.
Although Dizzy himself became hugely popular, his music never did. But thanks to his efforts, what had started as an underground cult is now recognized as the birth of modern jazz.
Dizzy was always very helpful with me, and I know with so many other jazz musicians. I once asked Dizzy, I said, well, when you were young coming up, who helped you and who showed you things? And Dizzy gave me one of those looks that said, man, did nobody show me